A lot of the work we've been doing over the last year plus, especially during the pandemic, has been heavily focused on this concept of fusion cells, which is, you hear terms like that now. Much of this goes back to our origins in the military. The idea of fusing intelligence across different boundaries at its highest level, a way to think about the concept of a fusion cell, which we really believe, especially now, coming out of the pandemic, any organization of scale or that's distributed should be thinking about either an informal process for doing this or a formalized fusion cell team that specifically focuses on what I'll describe here. So I built out my traditional organizational model. It's good at and built for this team here learning something, putting it in some sort of reporting format, goes up to this team here, that goes across and up, et cetera. We know how that works quite well. And then I can scale on top of that model geographically or even inside the same building by division or however you want to look at it. And so you create these mini bureaucracies or sub-bureaucracies, sort of standard organizational growth, right? And if you're all tuned up and trained and you get the right people and your process is good, this same sort of up-down model can happen across the organization, across regions, et cetera. And what needs to gets decided here. What doesn't rolls up into another sort of process. I go into my head of, supply chain that's in the headquarters in St. Louis, and then it reports up, et cetera. That works really well, right? There's hundreds of years to prove that model works well. But what many of folks that we work with have certainly talked about and felt over the last year is, what do you do with those non-standard pieces of information when you're interacting with a network type problem like a pandemic or a different sort of growing competitor, whatever the case may be, something that doesn't have to move through traditional lines where nodes pop up and they decide organically who they're going to connect into. It morphs, it adapts very quickly, et cetera. These sorts of problems spit off non-standard issues. So I pick up a piece of data down here and I say, well, this isn't really like a traditional reporting line thing, but I don't know where else to put it. So I'm going to send it up. And now it sort of clutters that reporting format because I've got 3 pieces of really relevant information and one sort of hanging chat out here that I'm not quite sure exactly what I'm going to do with. And when you scale that across a big enterprise that's covering a lot of territory or global, et cetera, you suddenly have this weird mix of one-off data and somebody's smart enough eventually to know what to do with it, but often by the time it gets back down, the opportunity's passed, or even worse, the network threat has grown even bigger. So the one piece of data that was originally identified, even if you could react to it at that point, it's irrelevant, right? So your problem is moving faster than you can keep up with it. So the idea of thinking also of your organization as a network, right? There are network ties that you can start to put in place over top of the traditional org, and you could scale that out depending on your size. How do I connect these as a network as well as through those traditional lines? And when I can put in the process communication-wise and identify people, either individuals to say, hey, I want you to make sure that you're tied in with this other office over here or our London folks, et cetera. Or you can even create if the organization is of large enough scale, a formalized fusion cell team that could sit here at headquarters, right? And so they have the responsibility of constantly scanning the horizon and saying, I've got my 3 people that sit in this office, and I've got my 2 people over in London, et cetera. They're bolted into the executive level, and their job is to be constantly scanning for this sort of thing. They're pulling out this non-standard information that they know needs to move faster and in a non-traditional way throughout the enterprise. And as that grows, they can then be networked into one another. So I have a team here, a team here. You get the idea, you can scale it out across your org. There's some sort of centralized control point. And so their job is to quickly pull up that unique non-standard information, fuse it across boundaries, see how this information coming out of the London office ties to the group in New York, ties to the folks at headquarters, et cetera. Make sense of it and say, okay, this is interesting. I think the executive level needs to know about this very quickly, because when I look at the pattern between London and California, they're seeing some market dynamic, whatever the case may be. I want my executives to be aware of that so they can think it through. And I also recognize that information needs to go down to this team down here, because some deal they're working on right now might be affected by this insight. And they have that sort of non-standard authority to go right out and through, oftentimes through their fusion team that sits in that space, or sometimes directly or in parallel. So it gives an organization, by building out that fusion cell concept or even a formalized team that is your Fusion cell, the ability to channel all those individual and unique data points that tend to arise nowadays that people don't know quite what to do with it, push that into the Fusion cell team. They can get it across the world, across the country, whatever your org structure might look like, and give you the ability to react to those individual data points, first to make sense of it, and then to react quicker than others in the market might be able to.